Would you like to play some football?
And welcome to another edition of Gridiron and the Gospel, a faith in college football podcast. I'm George Schroeder.
And I'm Brad Edwards. And week 4 of college football, it gave us some exciting finishes, but not much at the end of the day that was all that surprising. We're going to talk about what we learned from week 4, do a little bit of looking ahead, and you're going to want to stick around for the second half where we'll be joined by Jason Romano of Sports Spectrum, who was a coworker of mine at ESPN for a lot of years. It's going to be really interesting for those who don't know about Sports Spectrum to hear what he does.
And some of you do know about Sports Spectrum. He has a tremendous podcast, and just love and appreciate Jason. You guys are going to love that. But that's second half. The first half, we've got stuff to talk about with college football. And
we sure do.
Where do you want to start, Brad? I mean, week 4 was fun as always, and fun and frustrating for my son, George, and then for me too, but we can get into that a little bit later. But a tremendous day of football all around.
Yeah, let's start with one of the hype games that lived up to the hype, which was USC at Michigan. And Michigan makes a change at quarterback. Didn't get a lot of production out of the quarterback, but they got just enough offense to be able to survive against a USC team that, I mean, to be honest, George, I think USC is a better team than they were last year. We've seen them against LSU, and we've seen them against Michigan. Unfortunately for USC, they're 1-1 in those games, and the fact that they already have one loss in September with a pretty difficult remaining schedule, probably not where you want to be given what it might take to get into the playoff. But for what it's worth, like I said, I think USC is a pretty good team.
Yeah, I do too. And people wonder what they would be like after struggling defensively for essentially like every other Lincoln Riley team Lincoln Riley has ever had. They struggled defensively the last couple of years. And then Caleb Williams went on off to the NFL. What are they going to do? Well, first off is this. You shouldn't have been worried about replacing Caleb Williams. And don't get me wrong, tremendous, transcendent talent. But look back at his OU teams. All they did was reload quarterbacks like sharks reload teeth, right? That's what Lincoln Riley does. And so, look, Miller Moss is not Caleb Williams, is not Kyler Murray, is not whoever, right? But he's a really, really good quarterback, and he's going to be super productive in Lincoln Riley's system. And after Miller Moss, there'll be another one. And after Miller Moss, and after him, there'll be another one. We shouldn't have been surprised by that. Their offense is pretty good. They struggled because Michigan has a really good defense still, I think.
But they struggled in the first half.
Absolutely. They got
second half. They had their way with that Michigan defense.
Should have won the game. Should have put it away. Didn't. Here's what I'm looking at. And I don't even mean for this year, but I think that USC actually has something that you call, and I think you call this a defense. And I don't mean that it's great. I don't mean that it's elite. I don't mean anything else. But they made more. One of our friends, Stuart Mandel from The Athletic, made a point on Twitter that he'd seen more wow plays from USC's defense, which is, I'm talking about, you get athletes out in space and they make plays to stop the athletes out in space. They'd made more of those plays and tackled fairly well, and we can talk about 2 or 3 plays they didn't, which is huge, than he'd seen basically in the first 2 years of Lincoln Riley at USC. Is it 2 years? I guess it was. And so I think that's right. And so here's what I'm going to say is this. They're always going to be really good on offense. As long as Lincoln Riley has a football program, it's going to be that way. So now he's at USC. It was that way at Oklahoma. The offenses are prolific and really hard to stop. Always going to be good. The problem has always been defense. I mean, he had an OU team in 2017 that might have been the best team in the country, but they couldn't play credible defense. And that was a better defense than some of the other playoff teams that he had that might have had better offenses, frankly. USC, he had 2 years with Caleb Williams, who was otherworldly as a college quarterback, and they were terrible on defense. They were at least as bad as they had been in those worst Oklahoma years on defense. I think they have a defense. I don't mean it's great, And I don't mean that it's going to take them to the playoff this year, because you said they already have a loss and it's a tough schedule in the Big Ten now. What I'm saying is, I think if you're a USC fan, you go, okay, I see a little bit of proof of concept here. Maybe Lincoln Riley actually can field a team that has defense. And if that's the case, then you can build off of that. And maybe one day you might actually have a really, really good defense to go with that. We know what the offense is going to be. At which point you get back to what you thought he might be able to do at USC because of the platform at USC, occupies. That's what I'm saying, that I think we have seen against LSU and even in the loss against Michigan.
Yeah, and look, it's one thing to not be a train wreck on defense, and as you said, they're not. But you still, in order to win games, have to make plays, and especially when it matters. And at the end of the day, the defense gave up 3 really long runs by Michigan running backs. 2 of them were for touchdowns in the first half. And then the one that ultimately cost them the game was not a touchdown, but it completely shifted the win probability, where it looked like USC was going to hold on, and all of a sudden one long run and Michigan is down in the red zone and ends up scoring what turned out to be the game-winning touchdown, and a few missed tackles, something that we've seen a lot more of from past USC defenses, inability to tackle. But when it mattered most, they didn't tackle in this case. And so you're right. Like as far as the big picture, and a lot of people came into this season thinking, hey, if this goes south for USC, Lincoln Riley could be on the hot seat. And as long as what we see from this defense continues and they continue to produce the way a Lincoln Riley offense should, then they're going to have a good enough season that I don't think there's going to be any concern about his job stability. But ultimately, it is one of those places where you have to win games, and this was a game they should have won. And now on the other side, George, I look at Michigan, and while, look, they're just like USC. They're sitting here with only one loss right now. But I don't feel as confident in Michigan moving forward as I do in USC. If you're going to ask me who do I think has a better chance to still get into the playoff despite that 1 September loss, I'm going with the Trojans, because Michigan's offense, they've tried 2 quarterbacks now, and I don't think either of them is the answer. I don't think they have an answer on the roster at that position, not for this season anyway. And so I think Michigan's definitely got a few more losses that are going to find them. But it was a good win for them to be able to,
What is it? Our friend of the pod, Reese Davis, says if you're not good enough, a loss will find you. Well, they're not good enough in several losses. They've already had one, and several losses will find them. So, and they don't have a QB. That's exactly right. Now, hey, one shout out to just sort of the whole tableau of college football. I'm not a fan of the realignment. You know that. But it had been since 1958, since USC. They play in Rose Bowls is where they play Michigan. But since USC had been in Ann Arbor, and the big house was great. And it's the largest stadium. Obviously, they put more fans in there than anybody else, but it's not typically maybe the most intimidating atmosphere. And I'm not even suggesting that, but they had it striped out in maize and blue, except for the student section, which was all maize. And it was amazing, not to try to make a pun there. It was a fantastic picture of what we love about college football with those 2 uniforms in the stadium. And then they delivered a game that was full of all the imperfections and fun that we love about college football. So that was a great game. I'm glad you started with that one.
Yeah. And look, the other one that I want to get to, and I know there are a few more that we can just kind of touch on for various reasons, but as far as, the playoff hunt, the game that I thought was most significant was Tennessee at Oklahoma, because through 3 games, Tennessee had looked about as good as a team could look. The question was, what's going to happen when they play a decent team in a true road environment? And we saw that in Norman, and Tennessee passed those tests. I mean, to me right now, and look, this Oklahoma team, especially on offense, not what we're used to Oklahoma being. So I'm not going to pretend that this is a typical Oklahoma team, but they're good enough that I think we learned a lot about Tennessee. And I believe Tennessee, however long your list is of contenders to win the SEC title, Tennessee should be on that list because that's what they've shown us through 4 games.
Well, 1/3 of the way through the regular season, I cannot disagree. Now, obviously, there's more tests ahead for everybody, but that's right. And, I think we saw Saturday, NC State get rolled by Clemson, and you start to go, well, maybe that neutral site blowout win over NC State that Tennessee had didn't mean as much. And they had gone through a couple other opponents like tissue paper, right? Because they essentially were tissue paper. Oklahoma has quarterback issues, which is a little bit surprising because, they thought Jackson Arnold was the guy, and he just isn't ready. He's made some mistakes, and that game could have gone differently. But the Tennessee offense ran up against a credible, and Brent Venables has a defense in Norman. They ran up against a very credible defense, and the final score, I think, was 25-15. That does not represent the actual kind of the margin. Tennessee was up, I guess, 22-3, and they just went in and took care of business in Norman. How much of that has to do with Oklahoma not having maybe the quarterback they thought they had, or at least he's not ready or whatever, and maybe they've got a new quarterback? I mean, who knows? But I was impressed with Tennessee's defense as I was with Tennessee's offense. Because now, listen, I think Nico is terrific. This is the other thing too. He was ready for a real true road test, and that place was jacked. It was, speaking of college football and picturesque and the tableau of college football, Norman did it right. The Sooner fans did it right for their home opener and jumping into the SEC. And Tennessee was just clearly the better team. And that quarterback, he's going to be, if he's not already special, he's going to be special. So they're in great shape. But the revelation for me was the defense. I think Tennessee's defense is pretty good, especially the front. The defensive front is good. Really good.
And I think that's why Tennessee is a legitimate threat right now. And, they deserve to be ranked where they are, maybe even higher, but they're going to have their opportunities to prove that. But yeah, the defense, they lost a number of guys off of last year's team who not only, some who finished up their college eligibility, but some others that transferred. There were a lot of question marks on this defense. And the group of guys they have together, just from a chemistry standpoint, is just unbelievable this early in the season. And if you look at some of the metrics out there, Tennessee's defense is actually better than its offense. And that's tough to argue with if you've watched their games because, like you said, Oklahoma scored late after the game had already been decided. Those are the only 2 touchdowns Tennessee's defense has allowed this season, and both of them were in the fourth quarter after the game had been decided. And so you look ahead, and we're going to do that in just a little bit. I want to look at Tennessee's schedule related to something else. But yeah, as far as I'm concerned, this game proved a lot about Tennessee, and they might not win the SEC. They might not even get into the SEC championship game. But I think now you got to take them as seriously as you would anybody else.
Well, you brought that into the conversation a minute ago. So before we leave Tennessee, and I know we will real quick here, but we've been talking about Georgia, and then we put Texas in the mix because of what they did in Ann Arbor, and I think that's right. Okay, so Texas, Georgia, Alabama looks like it's not really skipped much of a beat at this point, and we'll get to the fact that Alabama and Georgia play this weekend here in a little bit. But Texas, Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, you're putting Tennessee in that mix at this moment.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I would too. I would not put any of the other, maybe, and listen, I probably should think about Ole Miss too, but I want to wait a little bit on them. I am not putting Mizzou in that mix at this point. Not based on how we've seen them play. I understand that they're unbeaten, but they could have, would have, should have gotten beaten by Vanderbilt at home. They didn't, and that's important. But my point is, this isn't even about the gaudiness of the record of being unbeaten anymore. This is about how good are you really? And I'm going to have to see a whole lot more from Missouri than we've seen so far before I put them in that category. Ole Miss, maybe they deserve to with those other 4 teams. I definitely put in Tennessee right now with Texas and Alabama and Georgia in some order. And it might be Tennessee on top, maybe. Who knows?
Yeah. You know what, George, we earlier talked about, some very offensive-minded teams that are much better on defense, USC and Oklahoma. I think you add Ole Miss to that list because they brought in some key players, especially on the defensive front, who I think have made a big difference on that side of the ball. And look, they're still putting up a lot of points, as you would expect a Lane Kiffin offense to do. But if you look at what they're allowing, now granted, they haven't played anybody great, but previous Ole Miss teams would have allowed, they would have been winning some of these games 52-20, maybe 70 to 31 or something like that. But they've have allowed one touchdown through 4 games, and I don't care who you're playing. That's tough to do, over a 4-game stretch. Now you look at their schedule. Of the top teams, the only one they play is Georgia, and that game is in Oxford. Right now, I'm not sure I would pick Ole Miss to beat Georgia, but if they were to beat them, Ole Miss should be in the SEC championship game, because there aren't a lot of other games on that schedule that are losable based on the way they played so far. I don't blame you for being a little hesitant to put them in the group with those other 4 just yet. I think here's where we're going to learn about Ole Miss. First 2 weeks in October, they are at South Carolina and at LSU. That's going to tell you whether Ole Miss belongs in that discussion, with Texas, Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee.
That's right. All right, real quick, and I know you've got a couple things. I just want to congratulate Florida State. They were a big part of our podcast last week at 0-3. They're now 1-3 after eking out a home victory over the mighty Golden Bears of California. So, and by the way, Cal actually is pretty good. But and we saw them, win at Auburn just a couple of weeks ago. So
pretty good or better than Cal has been. That's how I would say it.
Yeah, I don't know if they're pretty good. That's right, but they're better than Cal has been. They look better. So, and look, congrats to Justin Wilcox. But because that's a tough play, and now they're in the ACC, and to me that's a tough fit. And but congrats to Florida State to finally get that first one, and we'll see where they go from here. What is Mike Norvell able to do from here? Now, I mentioned this at the top, and I just want to lay this out there. My older son George graduated Baylor last May. He's now off in the Air Force. We've talked about that a little bit, but he and I text back and forth and watch Baylor games together. And a week ago, we actually went to the Baylor Air Force game as a family, which was fun because he came visit us, and we went over to Waco and watched the game. Baylor played at Colorado last night game in Boulder, and Baylor looked like the better team, in my estimation, for the entire game. And Shedeur Sanders played well, and he got very little support in terms of protection from yet another offensive line that looks like Swiss cheese. And Travis Hunter was tremendous on both sides of football. He's the best player in football, I think. I mean, he's unbelievably good. But Baylor had the game won. And George and I are texting each other about this is going to be kind of cool. Good. No, he's super excited. And then they give up a Hail Mary on the final play of the game to tie it. And then in overtime, they're going literally over the goal line for the tying touchdown, and they were second on offense in overtime. And Travis Hunter knocked the ball out, and it went through the back of the end zone. And that is how you snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And I have not been a college football fan for years and years and years and years. And so to the extent that I suddenly find myself like having an affinity, why did I choose Baylor? I am understanding the frustrations that go along with being a college football fan, because, for years and years and years, I rooted for the game. I rooted for the people. I enjoyed the moments in sports. And largely that's still what I get to do on Saturday afternoons. But I'm now learning what it's like to be a fan, especially when you're just dealing with the disappointment end of things. It's like, oh my goodness. It's like you got punched in the stomach. So congrats to the Buffs. Tremendous play by Shedeur Sanders to get them down, to win, to tie it. And then Travis Hunter is unbelievably good. But my son George, if he's listening to this podcast, is probably punching the wall again. And I understand. So y'all who listen and you all have a favorite college football team, and your favorite college football team maybe actually loses sometimes, I feel your pain.
I know what that's like. I grew up a Mississippi State fan. That's where my dad went. And
So sorry for
when
you.
when you say, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, I've been there many times. So
Yeah.
it's tough. But you know what? For those who think that Colorado adds, entertainment value to the season, and for people who might not be the biggest college football fans, just having Dion in the mix, is going to draw some extra eyeballs. And, the fact that they're still undefeated in conference play might, be a few more weeks that more people will pay attention, because the Big 12 race, it could be interesting. Although I will say the fact that Utah went in without Cam Rising into Stillwater and knocked off Oklahoma State leads me to believe that we're probably where we thought we were going to be, at the beginning of the season, which is that this is Utah's conference to lose. But there's still a lot that could happen. And along those lines, like while we're on the Big 12, I want to kind of shift into just a few things that I just kind of have on my mind about what's different about this season than past seasons. And one of them, so K-State, for those who didn't stay up late watching the games, I guess it was the second to last game that ended. The last game was in Hawaii, but the second to last was K-State at BYU. And if you missed that score, it was a blowout. BYU 38, Kansas State 9. That's 3 field goals for K-State. That is the type of loss that in past years, with only 4 spots in the playoff, K-State's done. It's like even if you run the table and you win the Big 12 with 1 loss, with that being it, you're not going to get in. But now, look, as bad as that was, K-State, and there are a lot of other teams around the country that are in this boat, it's like, okay, you know what? You got to get in by winning the conference, but you still have that path. And as long as there's still a chance for you to be the second place team in the league, get into the conference championship game and win it, you can get into the playoff. And so that's just one thing that just kind of jumped out, is that a result like that, if it's your only loss, you're still very much alive, because you're still obviously in the conference championship race. And along those lines, something else that occurred to me, and you may have thought of this, there may have been thousands of people who thought about this before it ever occurred to me. I think some of these conference championship games, and there may only be 1, it could be 2, once we get to that championship Saturday, might be a lot like what you see in basketball. When you get to that final weekend of the conference championships, or actually in basketball, it's kind of the final 2 weekends in some cases, where you have a league that there's one team that maybe they're in the top 25, and you're like, you know what? This team is going to be in the tournament, whether they win this conference tournament or not. They're going to be in the NCAA tournament. But if they don't win and someone else gets the automatic bid, that's going to cost somebody on the bubble a spot, right? They're going to steal a bid stealing league. And I'm already looking ahead, and I'm thinking, like, for example, in the Big 12, we could be in a situation where, okay, Utah, maybe they're undefeated, maybe they're sitting there at 11-1, and you feel like, okay, Utah is in. But if they get upset, then that team is going to steal a bid from someone else. And I can see that happening in the Big 12 for sure. There's a chance it could happen in the ACC, depending on how things shake out. But I would imagine there'll be some teams in the SEC and the Big 10, and they're going to be watching with a lot of interest on that Saturday, saying, please, no upset in those games, because somebody could end up losing a spot in the playoff because of it. All right.
Yeah.
Before I move on, any thoughts on that?
I think absolutely that's very possible. I mean, you could see that happen for sure. I think that, and some of this is, we just don't know, right? And some of it we won't know till those kinds of things happen. But yes, you can absolutely see that happen.
All right. So another thing that occurred to me, this is kind of the last thing I want to hit, is I can see the possibility that there's some teams that get to a spot where they have enough of a cushion that you'll already know that they don't have to win their league and they're in. And I guess to some extent, that's a no-brainer, right? Like you can see that
I'd argue
in November.
There's some teams that you could say that about in August,
and that's
regardless of what they did. But
well, that's true. But where I'm going is that we can sit here in late September and look at some of these teams, the way they're playing, look at the remaining schedule and say, even if they don't win the conference, I feel pretty confident that maybe you're not quite ready to put it in pen, but you're getting there. And let me just pose this question to you, George. I would have said, and I guess I still believe right now, I would have said before the season starts that if you go 10-2, if you finish 10-2 in the SEC, you're going to be in the college football playoff. Do you still feel like that's generally true?
Generally, it depends on who else there is probably in the SEC that has a similar record. But yes, generally.
Okay, and so with that in mind, I'm looking at Tennessee, and we just discussed how good they look on both sides of the ball, and I'm looking at their remaining schedule, and they host Alabama, and they are at Georgia. Certainly 2 games that they could lose, all right? But I'm looking at the rest of them. Looking at the rest of them, like even if they were to lose to both Alabama and Georgia, these are their other games left on the schedule. At Arkansas, home against Florida, home against Kentucky, home against Mississippi State, home against UTEP, at Vanderbilt. I mean, the only one of those that I might even give a remote chance is at Arkansas coming up in 2 weeks. But I don't see this Tennessee team losing any of those games. I don't see any of them being close. And as long as none of those games are close, if you've got a bunch of lopsided wins and then 2 losses, I think you're in the playoffs. So Tennessee would be one of these teams I'm looking at right now. And it's like, man, they would have to have just an absolute, like nobody saw it coming upset for them to not make the playoff at this point, because they look to be that much better than all but 2 teams remaining on their schedule.
I think that's fair. Listen, I think as the season goes, I mean, as we get a little bit deeper into the season, we'll identify a couple more teams that are potentially like that. And so when you first start talking about that, our listeners are going, well, of course, no duh, Georgia's going to get in regardless, or Alabama's good. But you're talking about the teams that are sort of have come from a little bit off the radar, even by comparison to the Ohio State no-brainers, the Georgia no-brainers. So
here's one more for you.
All right.
One more for you. After watching last night, I don't know how many people caught the Miami game, but if you haven't seen Cam Ward play, I believe they play on Friday this week. Catch a little bit of that if you haven't seen him. I could understand how, with him previously being at Washington State, that you hadn't managed to catch any of his games, but the kid is so smooth. He's so comfortable in the pocket. Like you don't see that from quarterbacks, where just it doesn't matter what the pass rush is like, how much pressure he's under. The kid is so calm. He never panics, seems to always find the right receiver, and he is just a tremendous difference maker.
Yeah, he's really good.
And he's got a lot of talent around him. But having that quarterback made such a big difference for a team like Miami that I'm looking at their schedule and I'm saying, who could they possibly lose to? Okay, there's one game on here. They don't play Clemson. They are at Louisville on October 19th, which I would acknowledge right now, that is a game I wouldn't be shocked if they lost. But the rest of them, with it being Miami, I'm not going to make a big deal out of who they have at home, because we know they don't have a great home field advantage. They have a better one when they're good, but still not one of the tougher places to play in college football. But these are the remaining opponents: Virginia Tech, Cal, Florida State, Duke, Georgia Tech, Wake, and Syracuse. Miami's not losing any of those games. I'm just telling you. I'm looking at Miami. They're either 12-0 or they're 11-1 if they lose at Louisville. And with that said, I mean, I think that puts them in the ACC championship game. Now, look, George, we've watched this long enough. It's college football, and even though I'm saying they can't lose, sometimes those teams do lose those games, and that's why we love the sport. But as we sit here right now, man, Tennessee and Miami are 2 of those teams. I'm looking at the way they're playing, and I'm looking at those schedules. And this isn't like the days where you would say, hey, you know what, they're going to go undefeated. They don't have to go undefeated. It's just like in the case of Tennessee, don't lose more than twice. In the case of Miami, don't lose more than once, and you're probably in. And those schedules are sure set up for it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it'd be interesting to see. That's the best part about it. All right. Real quick, games we're going to watch this week. Who should our listeners, who are you looking forward to watching this week? I can think of one that I'm looking forward to watching.
The obvious one.
Yeah, Georgia at Alabama. Looking forward to that. I'm glad they're playing. Doesn't happen all the time, and obviously it's going to happen less often with with more teams in the SEC. Georgia at Alabama is one I'm most definitely looking forward to. But other games.
Yeah, I mean, let me start with Louisville at Notre Dame, because, Notre Dame, after taking that unexpected loss to Northern Illinois, we know that their margin for error is very slim. This game and then the one at USC at the end of the season are the ones that I think are the trickiest for them. So for those who don't like Notre Dame, this is
Yeah.
This is a time where they could be. I don't know if I could ever go as far as to say that they're out of it, but I think that they could be in a world of trouble as far as chance to make the playoff if they lose this one against Louisville. And Louisville's another team that I'm interested to see them play Notre Dame, because I want to know how good Louisville is. As I mentioned, they're a team that right now you think, okay, maybe they could, be a threat to a Miami or a Clemson in the ACC. But I think we'll learn a lot more about them. So that would be one. And then, another team that I think we always have questions about until we see them play against the top of the Big Ten is Penn State. There have been a lot of times in recent years that Penn State looked really good, and then, they can't beat Ohio State, can't beat Michigan, whatever. Will we learn a little bit about Penn State when they face Illinois this week? The game is in Happy Valley.
Yep.
But Illinois, not a
Coming
joke
off
of a
a
team
win
this year.
at Nebraska. And I don't know what we think about Nebraska, but they're clearly better than they were a year ago in year one under Matt Rule, and you won in Lincoln. So, yeah, no, that's a good one. The other one that I know that you're looking forward to is two teams that lost in the Big 12, Oklahoma State at Kansas State, and that one sort of functions as probably, in a lot of ways, a potential eliminator in terms of getting into the Big 12 title game. And not necessarily, because crazy things happen in college football,
Right.
but they both need to win in the worst sort of way. So in the Little Apple of Manhattan, Oklahoma State at Kansas State. By the way, I do want to mention Notre Dame's loss got worse, right? Because Buffalo on the road in DeKalb beat Northern Illinois 23-20 with a last-second field goal. So that loss at home in South Bend looks even worse than it was at the time. So but those are some games this week. So
what's funny about that, George, is that, when Northern Illinois beats Notre Dame, you start thinking, oh, you know what, maybe Northern Illinois is the best team in the MAC, and then, they lose this conference game to Buffalo. Well, I had a similar thought this weekend when I saw Bowling Green, after having lost by only 7 at Penn State, they go and lose by only 6 at Texas A&M. And I'm thinking Bowling Green might be the best team in the MAC. We'll see if Bowling Green gets one of those unexpected losses like Northern Illinois just did. That's kind of the way the MAC goes. But
very possible.
But hey, yeah, look, if we're shouting out MAC teams, let's shout out Bowling Green for going on the road in 2 very difficult places to play and coming within a touchdown both times.
Hey, by the way, I know we got to move to our contest, and a couple of guys have joined us, by the way, in the contest, and you're welcome to do that too. And you're going to explain it in just a second and try to keep it tight so we can get to the second half. But I do want to say one of the things we haven't talked about is the reconstitution of the Pac-12, so to speak, as Oregon State and Washington State have invited some friends from the Mountain West. I want to talk about that, but we'll talk about it next week because I have lots of thoughts on it. We don't have time to get into it. But go ahead. We have a contest running, and tell us all about it.
Yeah, so the competition is basically this, that we kind of started where we had 12 podcasts left until the selection committee would announce the playoff field, and we decided each week we will select one team that we think will make the playoff. And by the time we get to the last podcast, each of us will have chosen 12 teams. Whoever gets the most of those teams actually into the playoff will be the winner. We have a tiebreaker. We're not going to get into it now, how that works. But if you want to play along, I'll give you an indication of how to do that in just a sec. But first of all, last week, our first picks, you and I both took Texas as a team that we think will be in the college football playoff. Now it's time for our second picks. Is it my turn to go first this week?
It is your turn.
Okay. I am going, this is just the logical place to go. I'm going to go with Ohio State.
That's where I was going to go. So instead, I'm going to go Georgia, just to be different. And I understand we said you can both pick the same because eventually we're going to change. But I'm going to go Georgia just to be different. And y'all understand I'll probably go Ohio State tomorrow or next week, But so you've got Texas and Ohio State so far in the playoff, and I've got Texas and Georgia. I've got 2 SEC schools. Still feels weird to say that. And you've got an SEC school and a Big Ten school. You guys can join in with us, gridirongospelpod@gmail.com, right? Do it by Wednesday with your second pick. And if you did it last week, please make sure you continue. We'd love for you to jump in. And you do have one more week to join, as you said, right? So
yeah, so if you didn't start with us last week, Yeah, if you didn't start with us last week, send in your pick for week 2, or not
But
week
don't
2,
pick
but your
Texas
second
because
pick.
that was your pick.
Exactly. If you didn't start with us week 1, your default first pick will be Texas. Tell us who you want as your second pick to go along with Texas, and we'll let you jump in right now. But this will be the last week, and then we'll close it up, and it should be fun to kind of track this throughout the rest of the season.
All right. We're going to go ahead and move to go ahead and shut this thing down so we can get to the second half, right? And we got to do that.
Let's do that. And we got a guest coming up, George, as we mentioned, Jason Romano from Sports Spectrum. And we will talk to him when we talk about our faith in Jesus when we come back for the second half. Just a bit.
And welcome back to Gridiron in the Gospel, a faith and college football podcast. It's time for the second half where we get to talk about our shared faith in Christ, the gospel end of the Gridiron in the Gospel podcast. And we do have a special guest today. Jason Romano is the host of the Sports Spectrum podcast, and we're going to get to Jason in just a minute. I mean, we're really excited to have him. But our favorite segment of our favorite half is On My Heart. And this week, Brad gets to share what's on his heart. So, Brad, why don't you go ahead and tell us what's on your heart?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our service this morning, our pastor was discussing something that kind of led into is a nice bridge to something that has been on my heart. So I'll just kind of introduce it this way. He was going through Mark chapter 2 and got to the part where Jesus says, I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. And then, kind of made a reference to what it says that Paul wrote in Ephesians 2, which is that, we're all sinners. And Paul says, but God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. A lot of people are familiar with that and familiar with the rest of that passage as you go through Ephesians 2. But the point that our pastor was making is that we are all sinners, and that by God's grace, we have been saved through our faith. And because of that, we now have a responsibility. We have a job, which is to partner with Jesus in his mission, which is to seek and save the lost. And so there's so many ways in which we can be a part of that mission. And what it made me think of is a couple of weeks ago, a lot of people listening know that I volunteer with the high school ministry at my church, which is not only doing some teaching on Sunday mornings, but also we have a group of guys that meet on Wednesday evenings as well. And I actually started with them when they were 7th graders, and that group of guys are now seniors.
That's amazing.
And so it's really cool to have watched them grow up. But unfortunately, one of the things that happened is that after COVID, a lot of those kids didn't come back. And the numbers dwindled significantly. And I would be lying if I didn't admit that I've been discouraged by that, and it just kind of bothered me that there weren't as many kids to try to encourage as there had been before. But what has been absolutely so rewarding to be a part of that was seeing one of these kids who was there from the very beginning in that 7th grade group in April of, I guess it was the end of his sophomore year. It was Easter. It was Easter of his sophomore year was baptized. And then 2 weeks ago, I got the chance to sit in the group. I was actually sitting in the pew right behind him as we watched one of his classmates get baptized. So I've seen 2 of these kids be baptized in the last year and a half. And it's one of those things where if you have not been a part of ministry, I just want to encourage you, look for ways that you can do that. Look for ways that you can be a part of Jesus's mission, because not only is it something that we're called to do, but it is just, it's so incredible to be a part of it, right? And you don't have to teach, okay? There's so many ways that you can be there for people, whether it's just simply encouraging them or, being a shoulder to cry on, whatever it may be. There are a lot of different ways that you can be involved, and I just encourage everyone to do that. It wasn't until it was about 12 years ago that I, for the first time in my life at about 41 years old, started to take seriously the idea that I was supposed to get involved. Up until that, like probably some of you who are listening right now, I just showed up on Sunday mornings and I would listen. I would shake hands with people and smile, and then I'd go back home, and I didn't give God, I didn't give the Bible. I didn't give the gospel a lot of thought outside of just a brief time on Sunday morning. And we're called to do so much more than that. And so just that experience of having been with these kids for, so many years, watching them grow up and then seeing two of them, even though the numbers may be down overall. Yeah, sure. I wish that I could have seen 10 of them be baptized, but just seeing two of them get to that point, seeing their maturity, seeing the difference this has made in their lives. I might have had absolutely nothing to do with them reaching this point, but just being a small part of it just leads me and encourages me to do more because I can see what's being done for God's kingdom through this group, through this church. And once again, I just encourage everyone out there, if you haven't already done so, find a way to get involved. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be a group of kids. All sorts of things that you can do. And I just want to let you know how rewarding it can be to be a part of what God has called all of us to do. And that's what's been on my heart.
Man, I love that so much. I mean, it's just real life. It's just real Christian life. That's what you're talking about. And you're talking about reaching others, right? In your case, it's students, but I love that. So thanks for sharing what's on your heart. I really do appreciate that, Brad. And again, y'all, that's our favorite segment. We would love for you guys to reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you about how you can have the same faith that he's seeing these students, these teenagers come to. So if you would love to do that, if you'd like to talk with us, it's gridirongospelpod@gmail.com. Reach out to us there. But let me go ahead and reintroduce our guest. Jason Romano is the executive producer for Sports Spectrum and the creator of the Sports Spectrum podcast. Before that was a 17-year savvy veteran of ESPN, an Emmy award-winning producer for ESPN Radio. And he's a longtime friend of yours, Brad, and I know he and I have been friends for several years too. And so, Jason, the Sports Spectrum podcast is something we want to talk about a little bit as we get into the rest of this. But I just want to say it's great to have you, first of all. And then secondly, thank you for the Sports Spectrum podcast, because I appreciate what you're doing with it. It's an encouragement, and it is an outlet and avenue to share the gospel. And so I love what you're doing with it. I'm glad that you started doing it several years ago. And it's a tremendous asset. So thank you for doing it. And thanks for being here.
Yeah, George, thank you for having me. Thanks for the kind words. Brad, so good to see both of you. And, just excited to talk to you. I love what you're doing with the Gridiron Gospel podcast. I think it's great. I love the segments. I love how you mix sports in and then kind of hit the gospel with them in the back half. I just think it's really cool what you guys are doing. And I wish there were more podcasts like ours, yours and mine, that we get to have out there. But in the meantime, we just be faithful where we are. So it's an honor to be here with you both.
Yeah, like you said, this is what you do too. Is this combination of sports, or if you want to call it an intersection of sports and faith. But rather than being college football specific like we are, you are general sports. And I mean, not just, the mainstream most popular sports, but I know just a few months ago you were doing a lot of things around the Olympics.
Yeah.
And so you're getting a taste of everything. And before we get into some of that, and I eventually want to ask you about some of your favorite interviews and things of that nature. George mentioned it. You were at ESPN for 17 years, and I think I was there for all of that same time. And so we had a lot of similar experiences, things that we could probably sit here for a couple of days and share stories and all that. But as you know, it's a big place. There are a lot of people who you work around, and it's very easy to go for maybe a year without running into somebody or not realizing you haven't run into somebody. And I got to be honest, you had been gone for ESPN for probably about a year when I realized that you weren't there anymore. I didn't know where you had gone. And then all of a sudden I start seeing you pop up on social media. So just tell us a little bit about what prompted you to go from 17 years at ESPN, being involved in a lot of high profile things that fans would recognize, to saying, you know what, I'm gonna take a chance here on starting something new with Sports Spectrum. Sports Spectrum had been around, but the podcast was new. So what got you to that point?
Yeah, it was, it's a journey of faith that ultimately leads me to leaving ESPN because, I didn't grow up a Christian. And then I started following Jesus and giving my life to the Lord about a year into my ESPN journey. And then I go on this 15-year journey of working at ESPN. And, both of you guys having worked in this business know, like, it can consume you and really it can become your identity. There's so much talk about identity in Christ. But let's be real. Like, if we're working at a high profile place like that, people are calling you the guy who works at ESPN.
Right.
You're identified that way. And so that was in many ways my God, who I worshiped, what I worshiped for so many years. And, it was probably year 11, year 12, when I started to understand not who Christ was, but started to understand where my identity needed to be founded in its proper place. I would say God was a piece of my life for many years, and kind of like what you were talking about, Brad, with what you were pondering about getting involved in church, right? Like, there's a difference between just going to church on Sundays and saying, okay, I'm rolling up my sleeves and I want to get involved more for the kingdom. And I think around 2014, my church here in Bristol, Connecticut, Hillside Community Church, the elders felt like I was elder material, if you will, and invited me to join the leadership board at our church. And I definitely didn't think I was qualified or capable of living up to that role, but I said yes. And I really said yes because I feel like that only could have come from God, right? And so about a year or two later, I started to think about my job. And I thought, am I supposed to be here at ESPN for the rest of my career, or as long as they would have me? Ultimately, we know what's happened since then in so many ways. Brad, you've lived it. But am I supposed to work there forever or not? I was 42 at the time, kind of evaluating, sort of halftime of life. And ultimately, I knew I wanted to do more for God. That was just what I felt like the Lord was saying. Hey, it's great that you go to church on Sundays and all that, but there's still more work to do in the kingdom, is kind of what I was sensing. I didn't know that meant leaving ESPN, certainly, but I just knew God was kind of prompting me to do more for him. And maybe both of you guys have felt that a little bit, that call from him, that nudge, if you will. And ultimately, it was a lot of different things that came together. I was meeting my boss, who is the president of Sports Spectrum, and having a conversation with him and just letting him know, some of these thoughts that I was having from the Lord as I grew into a deeper relationship with him. His name is Steve, and Steve and I would talk a little bit, but never thought that I would leave, because it was, you guys both know this, it's a comfortable position. You make good money, you work at ESPN, you got the Disney benefits. Like, why leave that? And that's when I felt like when I was offered an opportunity to leave to Sports Spectrum, that it was from God and not from Jason, because I wasn't looking for it necessarily. And it didn't make sense, because the job that I was being offered was to start this podcast and kind of restart, recharge Spectrum a little bit, but it wasn't a full-time job. It was part-time. It was a contract position. There were no benefits. It was 40% less than what I was making at the time at ESPN. It just didn't make sense. But I still felt like that was why it was coming from the Lord. And it was a time to really put your faith and trust in him. And obviously a lot of prayer and a lot of discussion with my wife, and my daughter at the time was in middle school. So there's some, things happening as she eventually gets to high school and to college, to think about finances and all those things. And I don't think my faith had ever been tested, if you want to call it that. And I guess I wouldn't call this a test, but it was definitely a leap of faith. And it was a test, I guess, in some ways, to walk away from that. But ultimately, I just felt like the Lord nudged me to do that. And 7 years ago, I did.
That I love that story. And I remember I don't know if I remember when you did it. I remember when you started the pod and just very quickly sort of took off. But from where it started, was it hard to sort of, talk people into it and to sort of joining you on the pod? And I guess maybe we should say that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, sort of the format is you invite someone on who would probably, people would know who that person is because of some accomplishment in and around the field of sports.
Yes.
They might be a broadcaster, but quite often an athlete or a coach or something like that. And then they share their faith with you in a nice bite-sized podcast chunk. And how has it changed as you've gone on through the years in terms of what is the Sports Spectrum podcast? What are you talking about? What are you inviting me to be on versus do you have people beating down your door to want to be on it now?
Yeah, that's a great question because I remember when my boss, Steve, kind of gave me free reign, and Raymond was my other boss, and they both said, just start it, scale it, do the best you can. There was really no guidance. There was nobody I was working with that had any production experience or broadcasting experience, which was quite interesting because I was really a one man band, a one man gang doing my own thing and starting it and trying. I was doing 6 jobs. So as you guys can know, in small ministry, you don't have a host and a producer and a booker and an editor and a social media producer. You don't have all those different roles. You just do them all yourself. And I remember thinking, we're going to run out of guests. That's what I kept thinking. First year, I don't know how we're going to find these people to have on. I just didn't. But what's really interesting, I think, is I started with the people that I knew. The people that I worked with at ESPN, maybe a few of the athletes that I had met, while I was booking guests or being a producer on the television side. I worked on the NFL project for 8 years at ESPN. So I had a lot of different connections in the jobs that I had, but I didn't know, I wasn't sure if all of them were believers. Certainly, I don't think all of them were. So I had to kind of find, okay, who are the believers? Who are the people that I'd love to target and talk to? And so I just started with the people I knew. There were a few people that were not well known, but had really good stories. And I focused, on those a little bit too. But I remember we had, Matt Hasselbeck on early on. We had Ernie Johnson early on. So we were able to get a few names that really helped, I think, boost the show a little bit. And, relied on social media to kind of help promote it the best way possible. And, since then, I think because it's been going on for 7+ years and trying to stay faithful to keeping the show, a staple or a regular thing where there's a new episode every week or 2 new episodes every week. I wouldn't say people are beating down the door to come on our show, but I definitely think at this point, 7 years ago, especially if you're a Christian in sports, you probably have at least encountered Sports Spectrum. Maybe you don't know it. I still think there's some people who have no idea who we are. And that's, I guess, the part of why we wake up every day, not just to glorify God and to point people to Jesus, but to say, there's still a lot of people out there who don't know Jesus, who haven't heard the gospel, who love sports, or maybe don't even know who Sports Spectrum is. But we're definitely in a better place now. And 7 years ago, and I think we're at like some ridiculous number, like 1,300 interviews or something that we've done. We've been able to find, I wouldn't say it's 1,300 people, but it's 1,300 interviews and probably somewhere in the range of at least 500 people, maybe more, that we've had on. God has been good in just bringing people to us, as well as me reaching out. Thankfully, I have those booking skills from ESPN, and I was able to put some of those into play to be able to find people, whether it's through PRs or agents or SIDs or things like that we all know about. For the most part, it's the direct relationships, or it's somebody who knows somebody and says, you need to talk to Jason, you need to be on his show. Those are always most encouraging to me. When people like Brock Purdy and CJ Stroud say yes to come on our show, that means a ton to me, because we are not ESPN and we are not, Barstool or Bleacher or NBC or CBS or Fox. We're Sports Spectrum, and we're a very niche programming in what we do with an audience that I think is very niche. But, those guys that I just mentioned both love Jesus. And I think it helps to know that that's what their, desire is to point people to the gospel. And, they don't get asked questions about Christ anywhere else in the media. So that's what we try to do. And I know that's what you guys try to do too. And, it's a blessing.
So, Jason, with what you told us, it sounds like it's made a big difference for Sports Spectrum as far as the success of this podcast and the way that it's grown. What has it done for you personally?
Man, that's a good question, Brad, because there are days when you can kind of come in and just I don't know, say that this work that I do, because it's important work, and I think it is, it's the most purposeful work I've ever done, that's for sure. But I have to be careful to not let that work replace my relationship with Jesus. Like, I can't say I interviewed 3 people today and asked them about Christ, so I'm good, right? And then I remember, and this probably happened about 3 years ago, where I got caught up in the work a little too much, where I may have put what I think is good work, important work, at the top in place of my relationship with God. And who's going to complain about that, right? Like, listen, look what you're doing. But, I would say whether we're working in ministry or whether we're working in the secular place or ESPN or wherever, we have to be very careful not to let anything really get in the of our relationship with Jesus. And I think I let that happen a little bit. So I think my biggest lesson in this is it still starts with me and God each morning, each day. and my one-on-one relationship with him. And when I let my work, which is great, which is a really great thing that I love, or even my marriage or my relationship with my daughter or my church, anything like that, if I let any of that get in the way of my first priority, which is my relationship with Jesus, then I'm a little bit out of whack here. And that's a big lesson that I learned, was as great as the work is that I get to do, and I love it, I really do, it does not and cannot substitute for my relationship with Christ.
Man, I love that. I mean, the goal, our goal as Christ followers is God, right? I mean,
Right.
He's the goal, and it doesn't matter what He's got us called to do, and all of us are called to follow Him. And so the question is, am I pursuing Him? Am I following Jesus? So I love that he brings you back to that too. So, all right, so along those lines of the podcast, best, or maybe a better way to put it is most encouraging feedback that you've received, because your message is based in sort of a platform for the gospel, right? And I don't even mean maybe from a guest or somebody like that. I mean like people that just sort of reach out to you. But maybe there's something that comes to your mind. Is there like a super encouraging feedback?
Yeah, there is actually. It's funny you asked that, because I'm going to pull my phone out, and I never do this when we're talking, but I just had somebody reach out, I would say in the last 2 weeks, and share this amazingly encouraging message to me on Facebook that I'm just going to read to you, because I thought it was awesome. A guy named Tony sent it to me, looks like 2 weeks ago. And he said, "Good morning, Jason. I wanted to take a moment to share how Sports Spectrum helped change the lives of 2 high school football players." He goes, "I have the honor of being a character coach for our local football team, which is in essence a chaplain." He goes, "And I shared the gospel with them following practice last night, and I used the Current magazine." So it's not our podcast, but the interview from the magazine stemmed from the podcast, which has CJ Stroud on the cover. He goes, "I received it in the mail yesterday, and I shared about CJ Stroud and how he finds his identity in Christ. And I challenge the players to do the same thing and put their identity in Christ and not the world." He goes, "Following the chapel, a player came up and asked about surrendering his life to Jesus and chose to follow Christ on the field." He said, "Another player whom I personally talked to with previously about Jesus came up and wanted to know more as well. And I was able to present the gospel to him." And he was basically saying, and he chose to receive Christ. He goes, "Thank you so much for what you're doing at Sports Spectrum and using the platform of sports to impact the world for Jesus." That alone was, I was prompted to share the gospel with these 2 football players. And I thought, wow, like he's sharing the gospel through a story that CJ Stroud shared on Sports Spectrum's podcast. And now there's 2 high school football players that love the Lord and have given their lives to Jesus. So it's those kind, and I don't get those that often, if I'm being honest. I mean, maybe we hear 5 to 7 pieces of feedback like that every 6 months or so. Maybe it's 10 a year, something like that. But I'll tell you, all it takes is one for me to wake up every day and say, wow, like just keep staying faithful, Jason, because God's going to do whatever he wants to do. And I'd say that encouragement to you, George, and Brad as well. Like, let's just keep being faithful, because God's working behind the scenes so many times, things that we don't ever see. And for that note to come to me and to see that, I sent it to my whole team. I'm like, guys, just our work matters. Keep doing what you're doing.
That's right.
Because the Lord's going to do something with it, because we're being faithful to him. And ultimately we're staying true to the gospel. And I just love that. So I think it's pretty cool.
You've got a bunch of podcasts that are archived online. Is there one that jumps out at you? If someone were to say, hey, if you could just tell me one podcast to go listen to, and this is what the Sports Spectrum podcast is all about, is there something that comes to mind there?
Well, I'd say don't go listen to the early ones, although those are the most listened to podcasts still to this day, because I don't think I was very good as an interviewer. When you've done 2 at that time, and now I've done 1,000. I've hoped that I would be a better sort of moderator of a conversation now than I was 7 years ago. But I would say my favorite podcast that came together is probably the Brock Purdy one. I know I mentioned him earlier. This was the second time we interviewed Brock, and this is the one I want people to go listen to, I think, because it took place about 9 days after the 49ers had lost the NFC Championship to the Eagles. So 2 seasons ago. And it was Brock's rookie year. And we had Brock on a year and a half before that, when he was going into his senior year at Iowa State. So we had him on in college, and he was great and shared the gospel and shared how Jesus has impacted his life and how much he wants to go into ministry when he's done playing football, and kind of uncertain, right, if he would ever make it to the NFL at that point, as both you guys know. So he has his rookie year, and everybody remembers Mr. Irrelevant, gets a chance to start and shines and helps lead, the Niners all the way to the NFC Championship game. But then what happens in that game, he has an elbow injury. Ultimately, he has to have surgery. The Niners lose, the Eagles win. And, it's a very low moment after a very high, top of the top, mountain top kind of season for him. In many ways, a Cinderella season. So I talked to his dad as well in a podcast. His dad is a former professional baseball player who we had on way before anybody had ever heard of Brock Purdy. And so I remember calling his dad at the Super Bowl. We were there Super Bowl week. That year it would have been in Phoenix, and it was the Eagles and the Chiefs Super Bowl. But we were out there, and I just called Brock's dad, Sean Purdy, and I just said, hey, would you want to come on Sports Spectrum and just kind of tell us what that was like as a dad watching your son have the season he had? And he's like, sure, no problem. And then I said, wait a minute, you live in Arizona, right? And he's like, yeah. I said, how far are you from downtown Phoenix? And he's like, 35 minutes. I'm like, could we come to you? Would you be open for us to come to your house and do an interview? And he's like, sure, let me just check with my wife, Carrie, which he did, which good husbands do. And she said, yes. And we had a car, we had our equipment, and we got in the car on a Tuesday afternoon and drove to Brock Purdy's parents' house and set up to tape an interview with Sean Purdy. So Sean comes in and he invites us in, and forgive me on the long story, but I promise you, because of what went on to get this interview, this is why I still think it's my favorite interview. And so we go to the house. Sean and Carrie, by the way, his wife, welcome us in, and they're like the nicest people ever. They love Jesus. The whole family loves the Lord. And they bring us in and they're kind of showing us around their house and like, hey, what do you think of this spot for the interviews? And we're like, yeah, this is great. Thank you. And then Sean kind of takes me and my colleague John with me, and we're kind of going through his house. He's like, come in here. Maybe this is a spot that you guys could think of too. And we kind of go into this sort of little man cave area. And there's Brock sitting on the couch playing video games. And we walk in. He's like, oh, hey, fellas, how are you? And I'm like, hey, Brock, what's going on? He's like, not much, just playing some video games. And we're kind of, I'm sitting there for a minute. And you guys have been in this business well enough to know, when you're producing, your mind goes to, okay, Brock Purdy's here. I have to ask. I have to ask him. Yep. So he stood up, he shook our hands, and I'm like, Brock, we're here taping interviews with your dad, and ultimately we ended up taping one with his mom too. I'm like, would you be up for 20 minutes? We'll be right here. Sit down. He's like, sure, whatever you guys need, guys. And I was like, this is amazing that this is turning out the way it is. And we ended up with 25 minutes with Brock Purdy 9 days after he lost the NFC Championship game, and then another 20 minutes with Sean Purdy and another 20 minutes with Carrie Purdy. And it was just kind of like, look what fell in our lap, but look what being faithful to the Lord meant, trusting in his plan. And ultimately that interview has been used. I've seen that on other people's socials more, especially last year when the Niners made the run to the Super Bowl, than anything. And I think I'm most proud because if you go back and listen to that interview with Brock, remember that it's 9 days after he just lost the Super Bowl and suffered a massive injury to his arm. Doesn't know if he would come back and be able to come back from that. And you would have never known that he hurt his elbow. You know why? Because the same guy I interviewed 2 years earlier at Iowa State was the same guy I interviewed that day in person in his home in Arizona. And he had just lost and kind of down in his dumps. And his identity wasn't rooted in the loss. And it was fascinating to watch a 23-year-old kid who was coming off a rookie season in the NFL talk about staying rooted in Christ. And what's funny about that, real quick, and I'll finish, a year later, he's in the Super Bowl, and we're in Vegas, and we go to see him, not like we got, 25 minutes with him, but we got about 2 minutes with him, and we found him, and I asked him a couple questions, and it was the same Brock Purdy that I talked to, a year earlier at his home and 2 years earlier, in college. The man is rooted in Jesus, and I was just so impressed with how mature he was in his faith at such a young age. And I pray, because he's going to get that big contract soon and he's going to continue to thrive, I'm sure, with the 49ers. Like, I pray that he continues to stay bold in his faith and stay humble. And hopefully God continues to do a great thing in him and his family's life. But sorry for the long answer, guys, but it's such a
that's good
story. And I just wanted to share that because Brock, I think, is one of my favorite interviews.
Great story.
Yeah.
It's a great story, and it's a great story. You know, we love it for the insider aspect of sort of understanding how you end up with guests and things like that. And that's a good get. It's a great get, right? And the way it happened is tremendous. What I love is who Brock Purdy was and is, and it's about Brock Purdy is in Christ. We started this podcast off, or this half of the podcast, talking about you and your identity in Christ, which I was sitting there resonating with because it was like God was working in my heart for several years too. And you and I've talked about that before. But here's a guy who apparently has that settled. I am a Christ follower who just happens to be the 49ers quarterback, who just happened to be the Iowa State quarterback, who just happens to be whatever he ends up being, but he's a follower of Christ. That's who he is. That's what I take from that story, and I love that.
That's really important too, the order, right? Like many will say he's a San Francisco 49ers quarterback who's a deeply religious man. But when your identity is rooted in its proper place, he's a follower of Christ who happens to be, like you said, the 49ers quarterback, who happens to be a husband, who probably will be a father someday, who's a son, who's a brother. Like all of those things come after his walk with Jesus. And it's beautiful to see. It encourages me because I really hope to see more guys like that in professional sports be able to say, you know what, I'm a follower of Jesus who happens to be, versus I'm an athlete who happens to be a follower of Christ.
That's right. And you know, the thing is, and this is not just a men thing, but we got 3 men on the podcast right now. And I think with men, we see that sort of that quest for identity that ends up being in our work a lot. And so listen, I don't have any experience being a woman. It may be the same. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying, I know what it's like for me. I know that there's something going on with men where we find our identity in our professions.
Yeah.
And I love it when we see people and when God takes us to places where we understand, no, your identity is that I have saved you and you are mine. And you're following me. That's what I love. So I love that Brock Purdy at a young age has apparently God's brought him to that place. And so you've seen him in highs and lows and everything else. He's the same guy. You've seen him when he was Listen, we watched him because we watch Iowa State. That's what we do. We're college football guys, right? Tremendous college football player. But the NFL scouts didn't think a ton of him, but we watched him sort of in obscurity in Ames, right? Ames is not the end of the world, right? But you can see it from there. Coldest place I've ever been is Ames, walking from the media lot to Hilton Coliseum on a February night for basketball, by the way, or maybe walking back at midnight. And I know you guys live in that area. All right, so let me take you to one quick question that's not faith-based. Just because this is a college football podcast, you live in Connecticut. You do a lot of things with pro sports. We were talking before we got on the air about all 3 of us. Please don't get mad at us, y'all, but all 3 of us are Cowboys fans or were Cowboys fans at some point in our lives. Yeah. Do you have a favorite college football team? And if so, who is it and why?
So I do not have a great college football team, and I think it's partially because of where I grew up. Like I grew up in Albany, New York.
Yep.
Siena College, which is big in basketball, on the MAC on college hoops is there, but that's about it. Syracuse is 2 hours away, so I kind of rooted for Syracuse when I was a kid growing up. I remember Don McPherson was their quarterback, and then Marvin Harrison came along. And so I kind of rooted for them, but not really. And, I never got into college football much. As a kid, it was always the NFL and the pros. Certainly when I got to ESPN, you can't escape college football. So I certainly started following it a little bit more. And after leaving ESPN, as I've talked to these coaches and players and anybody kind of associated, even some broadcasters of certain schools, I just root for people now. Yeah. And I'll give you an example. So 2 years ago, I had Don Munson on, who's the voice of Clemson football. And he's a devout follower of Jesus. He's been at Clemson for years and years. And Don was great to talk to on the show. But at the very end, he kind of just hinted, hey, if you ever find yourself in the area, you come down to Clemson, we'll take care of you. And I just thought, okay, that's nice of him to say. People say that all the time, right? But then I just kind of followed up. I'm like, were you serious about that? And he goes, I told you, if you come, we'll take care of you. I said, okay. So my buddy Scott and I were kind of planning a trip, and we've taken a lot of like stadium trips and done a lot of NFL games. And I said, what if we did a college weekend and we went to Clemson? And he goes, yeah, let's do it. So ironically, we picked Clemson versus Syracuse. This is probably, I think they were both undefeated, like 6-0 at the time. So it was a big game for that moment. I don't think Syracuse won another game that year, but I wanted to go see the atmosphere and just experience college versus pro. I had gone to Ohio State in 2016 for a guys trip. We did Ohio State, and then we did a Browns game against the Cowboys that weekend. And Ohio State was my first real big time college program atmosphere that I saw in Columbus. It was awesome, right? It was just so great to be in the Horseshoe. But then I went to Clemson. It's different down there. It's different down in the South. And the last year, we went to Auburn and saw what the SEC was like. It's different there too. And two great college towns, by the way, Clemson and Auburn. So I root for like that. I root for people. I root for coaches. I certainly look for the stories that resonate well with Sports Spectrum. But I just know like every single one of those college towns, you know, in especially in the SEC or down in the South on the Big 12, like it's just different. And I didn't really get it until I went and saw it myself, and, you know, tailgating and watching all the tradition before a Clemson game, and they're running down the hill and the fans get to go on the field after the game. That's intentional. Like they're not storming the field. They just go on the field.
That's right. They want you to. Yeah.
Want you to. I was like, this is fascinating to me, but I was so glad that we went. And so I don't have a team, but I kind of root for people and schools, and like, you know, I'll root for Clemson to do well because I went down there and saw that experience. I'll certainly root for Auburn. I'm just looking for good stories now, but I love college football. Like in the past, you would have never said, let me just sit on my couch all day on Saturday and watch football. Usually I was just kind of like, I'll do something Saturday and then watch football all day Sunday. Not anymore. Like I really, really love college football now. So yeah.
All right. Last thing from me. Back in the off season, George and I went through some, you know, off season type topics, and one of them was favorite interview you've done. And I know what I defaulted to were two different people that I had grown up watching. So before I ever got out of college and had any professional connection to sports, like these were people that I watched on TV as a kid. For me, it was Bobby Bowden and Brian Bosworth were the two. You were actually probably involved somehow with those guys being, you know, that I had access to them when I talked to them at ESPN, by the way, but that's another story.
Yes.
Do you have one of those with Sports Spectrum? Someone that it was just so cool before they'd even said a word in the interview, just to think like I'm sitting down with whomever. Who would that be?
Yeah, this is so easy for me because it was Darryl Strawberry. I mean, we're all around the same age, and I grew up a Mets fan. In 1983, Darryl Strawberry gets called up by the Mets, and he's Rookie of the Year, and I'm 9 years old, and this guy comes up, and, you know, I was in the middle of watching sports and playing sports, Little League, you know, obsessed with it. And then here comes this 6'6", 190-pound, toothpick number 18 with the Mets, and he's hitting these majestic home runs. And I think every kid who rooted for either the Mets or just were baseball fans during those years, especially in upstate New York, fell in love with this guy. And then the next year, Dwight Gooden comes along, and now something special is happening with this Mets team. And that's where I started my love for the New York Mets. And Darryl Strawberry, this story actually goes back before I was at Sports Spectrum, and I met him when I was at ESPN. And he came to do the ESPN Car Wash, which Brad knows very well, which was just a day of interviews at ESPN, and I got to be his producer for the day and get to know him. And we didn't once talk about the Mets the entire time, or baseball. We talked about faith and Jesus and salvation and forgiveness and broken relationships with our family members and our dads. We were talking about real serious stuff. And Darryl asked me for his number and said, and I'm like, yeah, you can have my number, Darryl Strawberry, of course. And he would check in every so often for the next 5 years. He'd just text every so often. Hey, how's your dad doing? How are you doing? Everything good? You still chugging along, following Jesus? And I just thought that was the coolest thing ever, that this guy who was my sports hero would stay in touch. But then I got a chance to interview him at Sports Spectrum. And that's when I think I've been the most nervous over anything I've done, maybe ever, but definitely at my time at Sports Spectrum, because I've never had a chance to actually really on the record ask questions. And I told him, I'm like, there's so many more questions I want to ask you, but I really want to keep this about Jesus. And he's like, no, you can ask me some sports questions. I'm like, all right, why did Doc Gooden stay in the game in 1988 in the ninth inning against the Dodgers in Game 4 of the NLCS when they could have taken him out and brought in Randy Myers or Roger McDowell, and you guys would have went to the World Series that year. And it was like the 14-year-old Jason just came out and talking to him. But I've interviewed him now 3 or 4 times after that, and it's still, a little, I still get a little kick and excitement of talking to my childhood hero. But the 3rd or 4th time is much different than the first. But that first one, holy cow, I was nervous. I don't know why. I was just a nervous wreck that this is my hero here that I'm talking to, and that I'm talking to him about Jesus. Like,
Yeah.
Right.
told me when I was a kid that I would get to do that, I would have been like, no way. Like, but here we were, and it's one of my favorite experiences.
Real quick story regarding Darryl Strawberry. So I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, which had the Mets AA team
That's
back
right.
then.
Yep.
And I'm the oldest of 3 boys, and so my brothers and I would go to the games all the time. And whatever summer it was, I had not gone, and the 2 of them come home, and they're like, you got to see this Strawberry guy. And he hit like 2 home runs in this game. And of course, if you know the park, you understand how far the balls went. They're describing how far he hit them. And turned out Strawberry was in AA for like 10 days. And then he goes up to AAA. I never got to see him play in Jackson, but a big percentage of that 86 Mets team came through Jackson. So
Yes.
even though I'm actually a lifelong Dodgers fan, I did root for those 86 Mets because most of those guys I had watched when I was a kid. So I can totally relate to the being in awe of Darryl Strawberry thing.
Well, ironically, he left the Mets and went to the Dodgers and broke my
True. Yeah.
17-year-old heart. I was like, oh, you're killing me. Oh, why are you doing this? But yeah, that's my guy. And I'm so grateful and honored because not many people can ever say they become friends with their hero. And God has allowed me to have that experience. And it's pretty
Awesome.
Cool. Yeah.
Really cool. All right, real quick, my favorite question that you ask on your podcast is what's God doing in your life or your heart right now? And it's sort of similar to On My Heart, our little segment that we do. But Jason, what's God doing in your life right now?
Yeah, I think he's reminding me that he's on the throne, number one, and that he's in control, even in the midst of some things that are being discussed and talked about now in regards to the work I do. And there's some exciting things coming down on the horizon that I can't share yet right now. But when you're done recording, I'm happy to share it off the record until we announce it pretty soon. But
we'll just put it on the next podcast. It's all good.
Yeah, there we go. We won't tell everybody just yet. But I think just reminding that God is in control, like that he's in control, and, to seek him first, which, Jesus talks about that in Matthew 6. And I think prayer has been a big thing for me in the morning. I've been intentional with when I get up early in the morning, 5:30 or so. I head down to my basement and I just pace back and forth and but doing that in a posture of prayer and just talking to God and thanking him for what he's done and, bringing my petitions and requests to him, but also just repenting of the mind that I have and the things that I look at and think about and say. Like, I'm not perfect, obviously, neither are you, and nobody is. And so that's why we need him. And I think he's been showing me to continue to seek him first and remember that he's on the throne. So.
And Jason, for any of our listeners who did not know about Sports Spectrum before listening to this, just tell them where they can find your content.
Yeah, it's simple. Our website is probably the best, sportspectrum.com. And when you're there, you can get devotionals, there's articles and stories on these athletes. And then, of course, the podcast that you guys mentioned is there, as well as it's everywhere podcasts are found, just like your show is on Amazon and Apple and Spotify and everywhere else. But sportspectrum.com is kind of our hub where all of our content is. And it's updated daily. As people hear this podcast, they'll be able to go and see new stories there. Devotionals Monday through Friday, great articles and some video content as well. Yeah, they can do that, or they can just go and follow us on social media too, because all the content's there too.
Awesome.
All right, well, man, we could do this forever, but we've taken too much of your time, man. I appreciate it. So thank you for joining us. Really do. Really do appreciate you. So
you're welcome. Appreciate both of you guys, what you're doing. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Thank you, Jason.
Well, we need to go ahead and get out of here, and we'll be back next week, obviously. But you can visit us online at gridironandthegospel.com. You can find us on Twitter or Instagram at gridiron_gospel.
And you can reach out on Twitter to us individually at George Schroeder and at J. Brad Edwards. Our guess is it's X now. Eventually, we're going to get that thing completely switched over where the Twitter references go away. So it's Twitter, whatever you want to call it, that's where you can find us. You can also email us at gridirongospelpod@gmail.com.
And if you'd go ahead and be sure to rate, review, and subscribe in your favorite podcast app, or as Jason said, I'm grateful that we are on all the major podcasting platforms, but just search for Gridiron and the Gospel, or you can follow the links on the show website. That's a good way to do it. And would love to see you guys become subscribers.
Yeah, and if you'd like to partner with Gridiron and the Gospel in any way, we would love to explore that with you. And email us at that same address you mentioned earlier, at gridirongospelpod@gmail.com.
That's right. Tune in next week for more Gridiron and the Gospel, a faith and college football podcast.